Well, at this point, Euthyphro is befuddled, and he's not sure what to say. And so Euthyphro kind of shrugs and gives up, and Socrates takes over and helps him out. He says, well, it looks like there's a connection between reverence and justice, isn't there? And so what is that connection? Is everything reverent just? Is everything just reverent? What should we say about the connection between these two things? Well, intuitively, there are a number of ways Euthyphro could respond. He could say the connection goes in this direction, goes in that direction. He could say there's some overlap, but they're different things. He could say there's no connection at all. They're just independent considerations. But one way of looking at it is to say, what's the relationship between ethical correctness and religious correctness? What's the link between something being just or unjust and its being holy or unholy, reverent or irreverent? Presumably, if something is irreverent, you shouldn't do it. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's unjust, but still there are some connections, presumably, between religious commands and ethical commands. So how does all that go? Socrates is raising a very important question here, I think, if we do have this religious conception of what proper and improper action are. It presumably relates in some way to a broader ethical consideration of what is proper and improper action, but what's the nature of the connection? Well, it's an important question, and Euthyphro thinks about it a moment, and he responds. Euthyphro says everything reverent is just. So he's drawing a certain kind of connection between religious considerations and ethical considerations. He's saying the reverent is a subset of the just. It's going to follow, of course, that the unjust, then, is a subset of the irreverent. Now, at first glance, you might think that's a little surprising. But anyway, that's what he ends up saying. The reverent is a kind of justice. And so the question then becomes, well, what kind of justice? Maybe we could start with justice and then talk about what the nature of the subset is that makes it reverent. Now, by the way, maybe he should not have agreed with this. Plato's mature attitude, as expressed in the Laws, is that the connection goes the other way. Justice is a form of reverence. It's reverence specifically directed toward other people as opposed to reverence to God. But, however that may be, Euthyphro chooses the other option. Reverence is a part of justice. What part? At this point, we get another definition, a fourth definition, which goes like this. Reverence is the part of justice concerned with serving the gods. In other words, reverence is giving the gods their due. It is being just to the gods, fulfilling one's obligations of justice to the gods. Well, that's a plausible response. You might say there's justice toward other people, and there is justice toward the gods. And so this is a question of giving the gods their due in the same way that justice might generally require giving other people their due. Well, it's not a crazy thought by any means. It's quite a reasonable thought, given where Euthyphro is at this point, or really just in general. Nevertheless, Socrates doesn't like it. Why? The reason is that Socrates doesn't really understand what it means to give the gods their due. What would it mean to provide service to the gods? What is due to God? Now, I think a lot of religious people would say, well, reverence, prayer, worship, praise, a variety of other things, maybe fear of God, maybe the beginning of virtue. And so there are ways of responding here, but Socrates finds it strange because he says, look, when we serve people, we typically try to benefit them. But what would it mean to benefit the gods? The gods presumably don't need us. What benefit could we provide to the gods? And so Socrates says, I don't even understand what this would be like. Now, I think there are ways of Euthyphro responding. But Euthyphro seems puzzled by this question. Now, Euthyphro admits that serving the gods does not mean providing benefits to them. What would a god need from us? However, he does say, still, it's doing things that are pleasing to the gods. And you can see now how Socrates is saying, I'm leading you back to what we just rejected. But it's not quite so simple. Euthyphro admits that this is something like providing service to the gods. But Socrates presses his point. He says, well, look, what could that mean if it's not benefiting the gods? Maybe it's helping them achieve their ends? But what ends could we possibly help the gods achieve? What could we do for them? What are the purposes of the gods anyway? Now Socrates is asking a deep question here in a sense. What's the point of worship? What's the point of praise or prayer? What's the point of religious respect for the gods or trying to give the gods their due? What are we doing here? What end does that serve? What, not end of ours, but what end that the gods have? Or, you might say, put it monotheistically, what is God's purpose and how could we help serve God's purpose? Now, as Peter Geach points out, it's not clear how powerful an argument this really is. After all, servants often don't really know the ultimate goals of their masters. Soldiers often don't really know the ultimate purposes of the commanding officer who orders them to do something. And so I think it's perfectly legitimate at this point if Euthyphro were simply to say, I don't know, it's not our purpose to know. And so we have texts that tell us these things are pleasing to the gods, that they serve the gods. How they serve the gods, what the gods are up to, I don't know. And it's not my place to know. I think that would be a perfectly reasonable response. But he feels uncomfortable giving that response. And so instead, he goes in a different direction. He says, reverence is a matter of knowing how to say and do things pleasing to the gods in prayer and sacrifice. We could say in worship and praise. Well, Socrates interprets this in an odd way. He says, so you're saying it's a matter of knowing how to ask the gods for things and how to give them things. It's an art of commerce between gods and men. Now, I think Euthyphro at that point should say, no, that's not at all what I'm talking about. Religion is not just an art of commerce between God and man. That's an absurd treatment of this. But he doesn't quite know how to respond to Socrates here. He concedes, I think, too much ground. He says, look, it pleases the gods. But now you can see he's fallen into Socrates' trap. Socrates can say, oh, so reverence is pleasing the gods. But wait a minute, didn't we just talk about that and agree that that couldn't be right? And so he thinks he's defeated Euthyphro. It looks like Euthyphro fell into the trap of going back in the circle to what he had said before. But that had already been rejected. So now it looks like Socrates has him. Well, how successful has Socrates been? Euthyphro at this point hurries off. Says, look, Socrates, I'm busy. I'm doing court. I got to get out of here. And a lot of people have seen Socrates, therefore, as the victor of this exchange. I'm not so sure. Because for one thing, there are several things that Euthyphro could have said. For one thing, he could have said, I'm not talking about an art of commerce between God and man. That's absurd. When I'm talking about prayer and praise and worship and sacrifice and so on, I'm talking about something that is nothing like just asking for things and giving God things. I'm talking about something completely different. And yes, I do think it's pleasing to the gods. And I don't know what their ultimate purposes are, but the point is really this. I am giving the gods their due. How do I know that? Because the scriptures, the religious texts we have, say that's what the gods expect of me. And so I'm giving the gods what they expect. Why they expect it? I don't know. What the ultimate purpose is? I don't know. But I don't see how that's a problem. I am serving them. There's no reason why I should know the goals of my master. He might have distinguished between the gods being pleased by an action because it pleases them, which of course is circular, and saying the gods are pleased by it because it's intended to please them. In other words, it might be what the gods desire is that we intend to please them. It might be that the expectation in prayer, in praise, in worship, and so on, is precisely that we try to get closer to God, that we intend to please God. In much the same way that a parent is pleased by the child trying to please the parent, even if what the child does is kind of, well, silly and maybe even a little destructive and not really pleasing in itself, still the parent is pleased that the child is trying. And similarly here you might say, yeah, you can't really do anything to benefit me, but you're trying, and I appreciate the fact that you're trying. So there's a difference between being pleased because it's pleasing and being pleased because it's intended to please. And I think the latter makes perfectly good sense. It is not circular. The last point, which some scholars have made, I think very perceptively, is that if the purpose of the gods is to craft human souls and to build a relationship with humanity, then that is something that requires human help. That's a purpose where we could actually help the gods achieve their purposes, because the purpose would be to create virtuous, to create excellent human beings who stand in a relationship to God. And if that's the goal, well then we do have to do something. We have to help craft our own souls. The gods can't do it alone. And we have to enter into that relationship with God. So I think if the purpose of the gods is actually to create excellence in human souls, and to build relationships with human beings, and to bring us in relation to God, then there is a sense in which we have to do something. And reverence could involve, for one thing, developing virtue in ourselves, and secondly, building that relationship with the divine. So I think there is a perfectly good way to rescue what Euthyphro has been saying there at the end. He can say, look, here's the purpose the gods have. It is to craft human souls and to bring us in relationship to God. And if that's right, then there's a sense in which reverence is precisely serving that end of the gods by making ourselves better and more virtuous, by developing virtue in ourselves, and by crafting that relationship with God through praise, through prayer, through sacrifice, through worship, through the other things that the gods say will help to build that relationship. So it seems to me Euthyphro's position by the end of this dialogue is far from hopeless. Indeed, it would seem like there are some obvious moves that Euthyphro can make. But he decides, maybe not entirely unreasonably, there's no point talking to Socrates, and he runs away. Whether he runs away in defeat, or simply out of frustration at the pointlessness of the questions and Socrates' reduction of the relationship to the gods to just an art of commerce. Well, that's up to you.